Thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this conference. The theme of my presentation will be the following problem. Namely, I would like to analyze the relations between rationality and morality, but in a specific way, because of course the topic is extremely broad and I would like to narrow it down in some way. So I would like to put it in a bit technical way. I would like to reflect on what are the relations between rational choice theory and moral decision making, and specifically I would like to reflect on whether rational choice theory can model not only non-moral choices, but also all types of moral ones. So I would like to reflect on whether the claim of many rational choice theorists, the imperialistic claim that basically it's the best and only method of modeling our decision making, is a correct one. And I would like to defend the following two theses. The first one will be that this claim is cannot be supported, that it's untrue. So rational choice theory cannot be used to model all types of moral choices. And the second thesis to be defended in this presentation will be that the negative answer to the first question has relevance for understanding so-called folk psychology. I would like to argue that the results which I would like to defend has important implications for the problem of the correctness of the so-called folk psychology, and to make a link between the topic of the topic of this day of conference with the topic of yesterday, I would like to make a link between my remarks about folk psychology and the discussion about the normative mind. So let me start with the first thesis. I would like to defend this thesis that rational choice theory cannot model all types of moral choices, and I would like to defend this thesis by showing that various ways proposed by rational choice theorists have many flaws, and that's why this claim cannot be supported. And I would like to start from presenting the so-called first account, perhaps the basic account and the most famous one, namely that the standard rational choice theory is sufficiently general to model all types of moral choices. Then after showing that it cannot, I would like to present a certain idea proposed by many philosophers whose names I will enumerate later, that rational choice theory, after a certain revision, but an important revision, can be used to model all types of moral choices, but I will argue that it's also an untenable claim. And finally, I will pass to the last account, which is, so to say, simply a result of the negative answers to the first, of the critique of the first two accounts. So let me start with the first account. The standard rational choice theory, the best theory, perhaps the only theory we have of rational decision making, is sufficiently general to model all types of moral choices. The basic idea used by rational choice theorists to defend this claim is the following. Namely, the idea is that a decision maker's moral motivation can be always reflected in her utility function. So just to give a simple example how it can be done, of course it's a simplification because it can be done in a much more complex way. Let us assume, for instance, that we have a game, a two-person game, which has n possible outcomes. When for each outcome A is player one's reward is also negative, reward is also understood in this context as a negative reward, so as kind of punishment. And B is player two's reward. So now, the argument goes of the defenders of the first account that one can construct various utility functions that reflect different ways in which the players may value the outcomes. And to give just a few examples. For instance, we can construct immoral or amoral utility functions. For instance, if P1 is an egoist, then her utility function is the following. He simply, for any two outcomes, prefers outcome, for instance, 3 to outcome 4 only if the option A3 is better than option A4. So in his utility function, the reward of the second player is not taken into account. So it is a simple way of modeling the behavior of an immoral or of an egoistic player. If, for instance, player 1 is of a competitive disposition, what he cares about is just maximizing the difference between his reward and the reward of his opponent. So again, we have a simple and perhaps a possible way of modifying the motivational structure of a competitive player, immoral or amoral, depending on how we understand exactly this idea of competitive disposition. And let us now imagine some, or present some moral utility functions as they are presented by the adherents of this first account. For instance, if player 1 is a sympathetic player or compassionate player, then her utility function can be presented as containing a certain variable which is less than 0 and which is higher than 0 and less than 1. And this is the variable which is a certain kind of weight by which the reward of the opponent is measured. So we can imagine that compassionate player's behavior can be analyzed in this way. If player 1 is a utilitarian player, then it is a special kind. Then his utility function is a utility function in which the value x is equal to 1. So the differentia specifica of the utilitarian approach is simply assigning equal weight to my own reward and the reward of the other player. So it again seems at first sight at least a plausible way of modeling the moral structure, so to say, of a utilitarian player. So far it seems that this imperialistic claim of choice theorists seems plausible. If player 1 is altruistic, then her utility function will be, so to say, a stronger version of a utilitarian utility function, because the value x is higher than 1, so it means that the player 1 assigns higher weight to the reward of the other player than to his own reward. So again, it seems plausible, and everything seems so far convincing. One can also go so far to analyze the player with a sense of justice with the following, perhaps a bit artificial way. That if a player 1 has a sense of justice, then her utility function contains a certain parameter which reflects her emotion accompanying the satisfied or unsatisfied sense of justice. In summary, on this account, this first account, this imperialistic account, which is a form of manifestation of belief in the universal application of rational choice theory, a moral choice is a special case of a rational choice. Namely, it's a rational choice in a decision situation with the payoff structure shaped by moral utility function. So it's a very simple way of arguing for this claim that rational choice theory is sufficiently general to model also all types of moral choices. And now let me pass to critique of this approach, which will be a bit perhaps scholastic, but I think that the arguments are quite strong. Let me first note the following, I think, an important thing. That when we speak about other moral utility functions, for instance, utilitarian and altruistic, then those necessarily reflecting moral emotions, for instance, compassionate moral utility functions, then we blur the distinction between moral agents with moral preferences, that is, agents who value outcomes of the game in a moral way, and moral agents deprived of moral preferences but making counter-preferential moral choices. I think that is an extremely important distinction, but this distinction is lost when we are using this method of presenting motivational structure in terms of utility functions. Just to give an example, the utilitarian utility function, which I presented before, may describe, if we look only at the utility function, above the behavior of an agent who has amoral preferences but makes her choices by appealing to the utilitarian ethical criterion, and the behavior of an agent who values outcomes, so to say, spontaneously in a utilitarian manner. Their choices are identical, so when we look from outside at the outcomes of their behavior, they are indistinguishable, but it's clear that they are made as a result of essentially different decisional processes. In the first place, in the first example we have, in the first case we have some kind of counter-preferential moral choice. We act not in accordance with our utility functions, nonetheless we use the utilitarian criterion of ethical choice. In the second case, we are acting in accordance with our utility functions because our utility function has a utilitarian character. And so this important distinction is lost, so to say, in translation. Let us again, and somewhat relatedly, look at the above explication of justice. And the above explication of justice in terms of introducing this additional parameter dissolves this sense of justice in fact into a set of emotions, for instance, moral anger, as one of the emotions which can be said to accompany a satisfied sense of justice. But of course, justice-based behavior may be of a different kind. It may be an instance of a rule-guided behavior, that is, of choosing an action consistent with a rule for the reason that it's prescribed and prohibited by the rule. That's a Kantian, so to say, understanding of this sense of justice. But again, this understanding of acting on the sense of justice, which cannot be plausibly translated into utility function as presented it before. And just to summarize, being guided by moral laws is a way of moral decision-making which, as it seems, cannot be expressed plausibly by means of utility functions. I think that a good comment and, in a way, summary of what I said before is a famous quotation from Amartya's great and important article, which is the following: traditional theory, that is the standard rational choice theory, I've called it in this way, has too little structure. A person is given one preference ordering, and as and when the need arises, this is supposed to reflect his interests, represent his welfare, summarize his idea of what should be done, and describe his actual choices of behavior. Can one preference ordering do all those things? A person thus described may be rational in the limited sense of revealing no inconsistencies in his choice behavior. That is, in the situation in which we understand utility function as reflecting only our behavior. So it's the interpretation of preferences of utility function as called choice interpretation of utility function. But if he has no use for these distinctions between quite different concepts, he must be a bit of a fool. Of course, it's a kind of ad personam argument, but he develops this argument in an ad personam way in the remainder of his article. So let me summarize my critique of this first account. The account, which is, as I said before, a manifestation of belief in this universality of rational choice theory. Namely, the first account seems apt only with regard to moral choices motivated by moral emotions. Because, of course, moral emotions have impact on the valuations of various outcomes, because the affective element of an emotion modifies the payoff structure of the decisional situation, and thereby can be mirrored by utility functions. So, for instance, if we have a spontaneous way of valuing rewards in a utilitarian manner, this account seems, of course, plausible. But if this utilitarian behavior is, so to say, a result of conscious following utilitarian rule, the situation becomes different. So, rational choice theory is inadequate as a general characterization of moral decision-making because it doesn't adequately describe counter-preferential and or rule-guided choices. Of course, the relations between counter-preferential choices and rule-guided choices is a complex one, because a counter-preferential choice doesn't have to be a rule-guided choice, because you can imagine a person who follows, for instance, situational ethics, and nonetheless he consciously implements this ethics in his life, and this choice may be counter-preferential, but it not will be rule-guided in the sense, for instance, of following a given moral code or following the categorical imperative. So the relation, so these two notions are not identical. One may perhaps speculate that rule-guided choices are always counter-preferential choices, but of course it may be questioned as too hasty generalization. And those choices which cannot be adequately described by rational choice theory may be of two kinds. Those which cannot be mimicked by emotions, those which can be mimicked by emotions, for instance, utilitarian choices, because they can be mimicked by emotions, because we have two ways of interpreting utilitarian behavior, as propelled by utilitarian emotions, so to say, a special form of altruistic emotions. And on the other hand, we have those choices which cannot be mimicked in this way. And as for the former, rational choice theory cannot capture the difference between their emotion-based and non-emotion-based varieties. And as for the latter, it seems that rational choice theory cannot model them at all. So those rule-guided choices. So more generally, the first account falsely suggests that counter-preferential rule-guided moral choices are essentially akin to emotion-based moral choices. So this obvious basic distinction is simply lost when we believe in this universality of rational choice theory. Let me now pass to the second account. Let us agree, or let us assume that the first account is really wrong, and let us see whether some revision of rational choice theory could not be helpful in the sense that it would enable us to model all types of moral choices. And this idea of revisionist rational choice theory was developed by many thinkers, but I think the three names are important here and the best known. The first one is David Gautier, second is Edward McLennan, and the last one is Peter Danielson. And they start from the following definition of a moral choice, which fits the description of those moral choices from the earlier part of my presentation, which cannot be modeled by standard rational choice theory. So a choice is moral in the strict sense, according to, for instance, Gautier, if it is constrained choice, so counter-preferential choice of a cooperative strategy. So there are two definitional elements of this moral choice, according to Gautier. It must be cooperative and it must be constrained. And for the adherents of the revisionist rational choice theory, the paradigmatic moral choice is the choice of cooperation in the one-shot prisoner's dilemma, but of course we can provide many other examples of games in which this idea could be applied. But this one is the most famous one, so that's why I limit myself to presenting only this game. And Gautier makes a very interesting claim, which is truly heretic for all adherents of standard rational choice theory. Namely, his belief is that the criterion of utility maximization, the fact that he applies this criterion shows that he still remains within rational choice theory, because he's using this criterion, he seems that it's an essential element of rationality, and he does not dispense with this criterion. He cannot imagine a different conception of rationality than the one which simply is based upon this notion. His claim is that this criterion should be applied not to particular strategies of an agent, as is assumed in standard rational choice theory, but to an agent's dispositions to choose particular strategies. By dispositions, he means, in fact, certain rules that may govern the behavior of an agent. And his claim is that a disposition, a rule, is rational if and only if an actor holding it can expect his choices to yield no less utility than the choices he would make were he held an alternative disposition. And what results does he reach after assuming this criterion and applying it to dispositions, to rules? Namely, he is trying to compare two types of dispositions, two types of rules of behavior. The first one is the behavior of a constrained maximizer, the person who simply applies this rule in real life, who makes choices which are constrained and cooperative. This is a bit perhaps obscure definition. What he means is that a constrained maximizer is an indirect maximizer, a person who imposes certain constraints on his behavior. And a straightforward maximizer is someone who seeks to maximize his utility function given the strategies of those with whom he interacts. So basically it's a person who behaves with the requirements of standard rational choice theory. And he tries to show that it's rational to become a constrained maximizer rather than a straightforward maximizer, which would of course show, if he succeeded in showing this, the truthfulness of this claim, that rational choice theory in this revisionist way can model counter-preferential, rule-guided choices. So it would be a really great achievement if he managed to prove this claim. And the simplest version of his argumentation. Why constrained maximization? Let us imagine the prisoner's dilemma again with those standard payoffs, the temptation payoff 5, for instance, reward payoff 3, punishment payoff, the payoff of lack of cooperation 1, and sucker payoff 0. And if we imagine two dispositions to choose, constrained maximization and straightforward maximization, we can easily show that it pays to be a constrained maximizers, the persons who cooperate with other maximizers but who do not cooperate with straightforward maximizers, on the assumption that the probability of meeting another constrained maximizer in a population is higher than 0. So in all those cases, it's rational to choose the disposition of constrained maximizer, the disposition to conditional cooperation, rather than choosing the strategy of straightforward direct maximization. In summary, on this account, this revisionist account, moral choices are of two kinds, constrained and unconstrained, determined by moral emotions, and the former are moral choices sensu stricto, those counter-preferential, and rule-guided choices, and both can be modeled within the revisionist rational choice theory as rational choices. The formers are choices of a constrained maximizer, the latter the choices of a straightforward maximizer. So again, it might seem that perhaps this revisionist rational choice theory is a sufficiently general theory to model not only, so to say, trivial non-moral choices, but also all types of moral choices. But again, it would be, I think, too hasty conclusion. I think that before passing to a critic, just several general remarks. In contrast to the first account, this account implies not only the thesis that rational choice theory can model all types of moral choices, but also a much stronger thesis, which would be philosophically very attractive, to some extent revolutionary, that moral rules can be derived from the principles of instrumental rationality. So thus, according to the first account, each moral choice can be modeled as a rational choice, but rationality doesn't require making moral choices. Whereas, according to the second account, each moral choice can be modeled as rational choice, and rationality requires making moral choices sensu stricto, those counter-preferential moral choices. So this revisionist rational choice theory is strong in two senses, because according to its adherents, it enables us to model all types of moral behavior, first, and second, it shows that the choice of a moral behavior is, so to say, a rational necessity. That if we do not behave morally, we behave irrationally. That's not implied by this first account. But this theory can be critical, this account, this revisionist rational choice theory can be critical on many grounds. Some are technical, some are, so to say, fundamental. The technical critique would be that Gautier assumes the transparency of players to themselves. For instance, that constrained maximizers can recognize other players as constrained maximizers and does not misidentify them. But this technical objection could be, and was in fact, countered by Gautier by loosening his assumption. He was trying to show that this argument works also on the assumptions of translucency, which provides that persons are neither transparent nor opaque, so that their disposition to cooperate or not may be ascertained by others, not with certainty, but more than mere guesswork. And it can be agreed that he manages to show that on this weaker assumption, his argument also works. But this is technical objection, which is less important than the one I would like to present now. The more important objections are the following one. Simply, it was pointed out, for instance, by Peter Danielson, that there are upper dispositions when constrained maximization and straightforward maximizations, for instance, universal cooperation and reciprocal cooperation. What is important in this context is that the strategy of reciprocal cooperation, this disposition to cooperate, is not moral in the strict sense, because it requires us to cooperate only with those who cooperate. It requires us to cooperate only when it's a necessary condition for cooperation. So, for instance, reciprocal cooperators will not cooperate with persons who cooperate always. They will try to take advantage of their, so to say, naive strategy, and that's why this this strategy doesn't work very well. And what is interesting is that this strategy can be shown to better satisfy the whole framework built by Gautier than apparently moral strategy of constrained maximization. And the main argument against the whole argumentation of Gautier is the following, that this argument implies that a straightforward constrained maximizer should play a strictly dominated strategy of cooperation than playing with another constrained maximizer. So what can we imagine a greater heresy from the standpoint of, for instance, game theoreticians than this claim? That's why this theory was very coldly accepted by rational choice, by standard rational choice theorists. And the last argument, which I think is important and which is related to the third argument, is that it's not clear why an agent who chose constrained maximization should be expected, when the moment of his action comes, to resist the temptation to switch to the strategy of defection. So, in fact, to play the dominant strategy. That's why the whole framework within which Gautier is trying to justify his two claims that rational choice theory can model all types of moral choices and that it's a rational necessity, I think is flawed. So let me summarize. The negative, the critique of the first two accounts, I think, leads naturally to the third account. I think that I cannot imagine, but perhaps it's hard to imagine the other versions, the other alternatives, that neither standard nor revisionist rational choice theory can model all types of moral choices. And to be more precise, there are two types of moral choices. Those determined by moral emotions, which can be aptly reflected in the payoff structures by means of the different utility functions. And these choices can be modeled by standard rational choice theory. And moral choices which are not determined by moral emotions, counter-preferential moral choices, rule-guided behavior, and they cannot be modeled by standard rational choice theory. I do not take into account the revisionist rational choice theory because I think that the arguments against this theory are conclusive. So the basic conclusion is the following, that the problem of moral decision-making appears to reveal the limits of rational choice theory. Of course, one could formulate the following objection. I was speaking about standard rational choice theory. I was speaking about revisionist rational choice theory, but why I did not mention what could be called extended rational choice theory, something which is not such an obvious heresy for traditional rational choice theorists as, for instance, the Gautier's claim. So let me make some remarks on perhaps this fourth account, but I think it's also mistaken for many reasons. That's why I didn't put it explicitly as a fourth account. So we have the following objection. What about extended rational choice theory? Two versions of extended rational choice theory are well known to me, and I think that they are not convincing. The first one is the famous account of rational choice theory proposed by Robert Nozick, who was proposing to replace this very austere way of analyzing human decisions, which is based only on expected utility, otherwise understood in various ways, but of expected utility of outcomes, and discounting, neglecting what for him is extremely important, symbolic utility. So he's trying to show that our choices should be analyzed by by a richer decision-making formula, which he calls decision value formula, which contains three elements. The first one is expected utility, the so-called causal expected utility. I will not go into details what is the difference between the causal expected utility and between evidential expected utility because it's a bit technical, but it doesn't matter. These two elements, so to say, fit into this standard rational choice theory. And this original contribution of Nozick is the symbolic utility, which for him is equally important as the two previous ones. So he says that a rational agent should simply maximize this weighted value of three types of utilities: causally expected utility, evidential expected utility, and symbolic utility. But the problem with this account, I think, is similar to the one raised by Sen with reference to standard rational choice theory. That simply this theory, especially this third element, has too little structure. Because the symbolic utility in Nozick's views is supposed to embrace very, very different things. So it's over-inclusive. For instance, if you are following the categorical imperative, it can be expressed by means of symbolic utility. If you are acting according to some other ethical criterion, again, it would be symbolic utility, because by doing this, you are trying to show that you are following a given criterion. It's simply too, I think, inclusive. That's why it cannot be used to capture those, I think, important distinctions which I raised in the previous part of my lecture. The other idea, which also I can discuss only very perfunctorily, is Amartya Sen's permissibility function. He basically says that our decision-making in the context of moral choices is two-stage. The first stage can be reflected by this permissibility function, which is a function which narrows down the set of available actions to an agent. And this is the element of rational decision-making which goes, so to say, beyond the standard rational choice theory. And once we have narrowed down this set of available actions to this narrower set, determined by this permissibility function, then we apply the standard criterion of rational choice. So we maximize the expected utility and taking into account only those options which are permitted by this permissibility function. But again, there's, I think, a fundamental two important problems with this account. The first one is that in the introducing of this variable, of this function, doesn't tell us anything about the structure, the nuances, the details of these decision processes which lead to narrowing down a given set of options. So we lose something important by just satisfying ourselves with introducing this kind of variable. And I think another important thing, it may be so that this permissibility function picks up only one element subset of S. So it would mean that this function, in fact, determines the final choice. So in this case, following strictly sense argumentation, we would not have, so to say, space for applying the maximization criterion, because all would be done by this permissibility function, which is mysterious because nobody really knows what decisional processes are hidden behind them. So I think that it's hard to find an extended version of rational choice theory, which would not be, so to say, obviously heretical for standard rational choice theorists, that would be adequate for describing various all types of moral choices, so that it would satisfy this imperialistic claim of rational choice theorists. So let me now pass to my thesis 2, which will be, so to say, less worked out than the first one and perhaps a bit hasty. But I think that the conclusions which I have reached in the first part of my presentation have certain importance for understanding the so-called folk psychology. Because the first important thing to be noticed is that the essence of this folk psychology, the spontaneous way in which we understand and explain and predict human actions, this belief-desire model of human decision-making, it can be treated as underlying rational choice theory, or to be more precise, rational choice theory can be seen as a sophisticated formulation of this model, this Humean model in point of fact. But given the conclusions of the first part of my presentation, it may be so that this Humean model may require a correction. And the correction would be the following one. It seems that in moral decision-making we can in the context of moral decision-making, we can distinguish two incarnations of this folk psychology. In the first case, we have the standard version, belief-desire version of folk psychology, but perhaps with reference to those counter-preferential rule-guided choices, we should speak more plausibly about belief way of explaining human actions. And to be more precise, the belief-desire model would be a proper one if a moral choice is motivated by moral emotions, for instance, compassion. So it would be adequate with respect to those emotions which can be plausibly modeled by means of standard rational choice theory. And the non-moral belief or moral belief model, so this double belief model, would be proper if a moral choice is not motivated by moral emotions. Of course, one would have to develop it in more detail and to say exactly what is perhaps, if any, the difference between these two types of beliefs. For instance, one could say that those moral beliefs differ from non-moral beliefs in that they imply in some natural sense what can be called, to use the Rawlsian jargon, higher order desire to act ethically. This view is sometimes called in moral philosophy moral externalism, that simply beliefs can be sufficient for motivating human action. Of course, it's heretical for all adherents of the Humean model, but great philosophers, starting from, for instance, Socrates and finishing with her, perhaps here is a controversial figure here, seem to defend this kind of non-Humean model, which is accordance with my earlier claim about the insufficiency of rational choice theory for modeling moral choices. I would like to just marginally to mention an interesting formal result, which paradoxically can support the thesis which I presented. In a series of, how many time I have? 5 minutes, thank you very much. In a series of fascinating but forbiddingly technical papers, David Lewis proved a very interesting claim that if you would like to model this belief model by means of rational choice theory, then it would be impossible. we simply encounter interesting paradoxes. The basic idea is the following, that the traditional way of revising beliefs and the traditional way of revising desires are incoherent in many cases. And if it's so, we cannot assume some kind of identity between belief and desires. So this negative result is interesting in the sense that it in some way supports this general claim that which I presented in a completely different way, not technical and, so to say, conceptual, that rational choice theory doesn't deal with those counter-preferential rule-guided choices which can be seen as stemming, as flowing from beliefs, as certain motivating factors. So I think that, of course, this thesis too has to be worked out because it's just presented here in a sketchy way. Is supported to some extent by this first part of my presentation. And let me now pass to the second element of my thesis too, which was supposed to present some kind of link between what I said today and the idea of the normative mind. And I would like to make the following claims, that the idea of folk psychology and the normative mind are strictly connected to each other. Let me start from, so to say, terminological remark. The normative mind can be understood in, I think, two essentially different ways. The first way is the way which was with much eloquence, for instance, defended by Bartik yesterday, which basically reduces the normative mind to the action-directed mind, to the view of mind as a problem solver and a specific problem solver which is focused on practical problems, not theoretical ones. So this view, I think, has many important philosophical predecessors. I think that the most interesting, for me at least, descriptions of this view of mind was paradoxically can be found in Schopenhauer in the first book of his Die Welt als Wille und Vorstellung. But of course, for instance, also American instrumentalists were very close to this view. And it's one understanding of the normative mind as, so to say, the practical, action-directed mind. But I think there's a different understanding of the normative mind as perhaps, I'm not sure, less or more controversial, as the mind which is, so to say, inherently directed at shaping its beliefs and desires according to some normative criteria. So we can be said to possess the normative mind because we want to shape our beliefs and desires in accordance with normative criteria. This view assumes just 1 minute. This view assumes that beliefs and desires can be seen as important elements of explaining of our behavior, so as having some causal influence on our behavior, not just as being certain kind of phenomena. And of course, we are seen as simply shaping, being able to shape in a real way our beliefs and desires. And in order to sustain this view, we have to assume that the folk psychology level of description, which assume the causal efficacy of beliefs and desires, is a true one. It's not some kind of apparent way of explaining human behavior or fundamentally flawed. So I think that the idea, the claim that folk psychology is true is the necessary condition for assuming the claim about the intrinsically normative mind. Whether it's sufficient condition, one can discuss this issue, but I think that if we assume that folk psychology is false, and if we assume, for instance, some kind of epiphenomenalist view of mind or a version of eliminative materialism, then it's hard to sustain this idea of the normative mind, because those beliefs and desires which we invoke in our explanation of human behavior simply have no real causal force. It just seems to us that they have a causal force, but everything what is important takes place at the lower level, the level which can be adequately described by the natural sciences, so this neurobiological level. Just to conclude, my first claim that rational choice theory is not sufficient for analyzing all types of moral choices, for capturing, for adequately modeling all types of moral choices, has important consequences for understanding folk psychology, because perhaps it requires it's not so much modification, but enriching it by taking into account this belief model. And this last claim is that the question about the truthfulness of folk psychology has important implications for discussion about whether our mind is really normative or not normative in the second sense, not in the sense of action-directed mind, but in the sense which I presented as complementary, not contradictory with the first one, I think at least. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, we have time for questions.
Thank you for the talk. I'm very I mean, I agree with you in many respects. But I mean, there is a third way to survive. For example, because you basically focused on one-shot games, right? Why don't use the evolutionary approach, or at least these indefinitely repeated games, right? For example, I disagree with Gautier. I agree with you, but you could apply the constraint maximizer in a repeated game, and then you have a way for checking whether the other players are constraint maximizer, right? You look in the past, and then you are able to make a reliable guess in regard to the future decisions, or this is one way, or approaching, full evolutionary game theory. In that sense, you can derive from strategic interaction moral norms, which is well-known thesis, from Axelrod onwards. So this is one comment. The second comment is regards to the belief model, right? So the fact that you only have beliefs. Yeah, there are ways for surviving as well. You may have that you combine beliefs with some ideal conditions like perfect information, impartiality, So you didn't mention that there are models, in the literature. So I'm curious what you think on that, right? Thank you.
Thank you very much. As for your first comment, of course, the results of the analysis of repeated games are relevant for this problem, but I think they would not solve the problem for two reasons at least. The first reason is that if we wanted to show to which type of moral choices those repeated games can be listed, I think it would be the first one, in which we are just acting in accordance with our preferences. So we are just behaving like those agents who have, for instance, compassionate utility functions. We just do not have the need to constrain our choices. So we would still have to do with this first type of moral choices, very specific one, because for many reasons, because in this case we also could have agents who have no moral emotions, yes? So because we can have agents who have basically the moral preferences, the preferences typical for the prisoner's dilemma, but nonetheless those preferences in a repeated game infinitely or indefinitely generate cooperative behavior. So there would be a third type of behavior which would not be moral in the common sense. Because we have agents who neither have moral emotions, nor do they constrain their actions. So it would be just behavior which would be perfectly mimicking real behavior, just as it pays to be honest. So in the long run, it pays to be, for instance, an honest merchant, because in this way we can really become better off than otherwise. So that's why also Gautier, in his analysis, I think in this case I agree with him, he simply neglects, doesn't take into account the results of indefinitely or infinitely repeated games, because for him the choices of, for instance, tit-for-tat player or grim trigger are not constrained choices, nor moral in the sense that shaped by moral utility functions. So that's why I think it will work. And as regards your second comment, I also believe that belief model could survive, perhaps in some bizarre version invented by some philosophers who are trying to argue, but I'm not sure if it's not some aberration of analytical thinking, that those moral beliefs are called by them not beliefs, but desires. So it's a bit, they just combine important elements of beliefs. They are not simple cognitive attitudes as basically those which are analyzed in standard rational choice theory. They have more distinct cognitive element, and they have this self-motivating function, and they call it by bizarre name of desires. But I think there are interesting ways of trying to defend this non-Humean version of human motivation, because I think that this, for many reasons, not also the ones which I presented, it has some flaws. Just belief, desire, this human axiom that there's no conceptual notion between belief and desires is convincing. But this was one way of arguing, so to say, an around way of arguing that is inconvincing. That from the analysis of moral choices we can pass to this claim about folk psychology.
Questions, so thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.